Conor has written numerous publications, including Pursuing Joy with Deleuze, Transcendental Empiricism and Affirmative Naturalism as Worldly Practice in the Deleuze and Guattari Studies Journal, Stupidity and Study in the Contemporary University in La Delusiana, and most recently, Rhythmic New Techniques, Stiegler, Whitehead, and Neotic Life in, which sort of in the Journal of Educational Philosophy and Theory, but also republished as a book chapter somewhere else, I think, as well, which is, you know, he's all over the place. There are loads of others too, but it might be easier to direct everyone to his website, conor-heaney.com. I'll put it in the chat. It's all sort of it's all sort of up-to-date information about what he's got going on, including the occasional blog, which is always nice. Conor's more broadly interested in political and legal theory, French theory and continental philosophy, process philosophy, philosophy of time, and the philosophy of technology, but more specifically, he is currently working on a monograph which seeks to articulate innovative rhythm analytical approach to both legal theory and socio-legal studies. And as I understand it, he'll be discussing a version of one of these chapters from this monograph today, entitled Rhythms of Everyday Life in Plato's Laws. So I think, is that everything, Conor? I think that's everything, yeah? So Conor will be about 40 minutes, I think, and then we'll do a Q&A afterwards for about half an hour, whatever, finish around 5-ish. If anyone wants to hang around after the recording and have a chat with Conor, you know, he will be signing autographs through the virtual screen. Yeah, we'll be welcome to have a chat afterwards. And anyway, yeah, I'll take it away, Conor, really. Oh, you're muted, Conor.
I thought I had unmuted there, sorry. Thank you very much for that, Jonjo. Is the audio okay for everyone? Is it, yeah, not too echoey or anything? Okay, thank you. So I do have slides, so let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, so can I get a thumbs up from anyone? Yep, that's visible. Okay, so I'll just set my timer here because I can go on a bit sometimes. So, well, first of all, before getting into anything, I'd just like to thank Jonjo and Robert primarily for inviting me to participate in this fascinating series. I only hope that some of these sort of scattered thoughts can live up to what's kind of gone before and what's going to come after. And as well, although they're not here, my thanks go to everyone else involved in putting these events together, sort of professional services, things like that, because I know just how much work goes into trying to put these things together. So before I launch into a bit of a discussion of Plato and sort of a bit of a contextualization in the context of legal theory, which I'm going to get to in a bit, I think the first thing I'd like to do today is just outline a little bit of context on what I'm presenting and where this research is coming from. So, like many of you here, if you're attending sessions in this series, if I may venture to presume, I became interested in the notion of everyday life. I'll try and sync up my bullet points with my speech as best I can. I became interested in the notion of everyday life, both as a concept and as an embodied experience, as a concept that really is sort of indissociable from the concrete. And so my own conceptual entry point into the notion of everyday life has been alongside, as it were, another one, that being the concept of rhythm, which was central to my doctorate and a lot of my research since then. And so while my initial reference points were in the work, and still are, my initial reference points were and largely still are in the works of people like Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari, Bernard Stiegler, Henri Lefebvre, and so on, what my interest in the concept of rhythm helped open up for me was a really open and rich philosophical field, still not really explored in the sort of depth that we see in some other related concepts. And the intellectual history of the concept of rhythm isn't limited to philosophy. It's entangled with related discussions and concepts such as that of order, time, cosmology, aesthetics, ethics, politics, economics, the nature of life, and about the character of living processes. So, for example, whether it is in how our biological clocks in the sleep-wake cycle are attuned to and have historically co-evolved with solar rhythms, to how we organize our time through technologies of time measurement, which synchronize social action, to how legal institutions and everyday legal obligations order and sequence our movements. The notion of rhythm immediately puts us, or at least for me, puts me in a space where biology, ecology, law, politics, history, and so on, so all intersect. Similar to the notion of everyday life, the notion of rhythm moves between the abstract and the concrete. So think of how the study of rhythm can be and is subject to formalization and abstraction in readings of, for example, poetic meter and poetic rhythm, or is subject to empirical and quantitative forms of examination in the fields of biology and history, to more qualitative elements such as the feeling of rhythm when we listen to a song or engage with music in some way, when we dance, or even in the course of the working week when we get into those cycles, habits, and rituals that sort of characterize and punctuate everyday life. So whenever we engage with the concept of rhythm and its history, it's probably not a huge surprise to find that Plato has played an historically crucial role. So whether his work was simply a consolidation of how this notion was developing anyway, or whether Plato did something special and added something extra to it is sort of an open question. But nonetheless, what we can see in Plato really for the first time in this sort of Western philosophical tradition is the definition of rhythm as an ordered sequence of movements which can be numerically measured and regulated. So an ordered sequence of movements which can be numerically measured and regulated. Furthermore, as I noted in the abstract, if you happen to have a look at it, there's no dialogue where Plato uses the term rhythm, which was an important term for him throughout his corpus, his dialogues. There's no dialogue where he uses the term more than in his final one, the laws. And so whilst this is partially explained by the fact that the dialogue itself, as anyone who's tried to read it will know, is at times painfully long, it's his longest, and in some places a little bit unfinished and disorganized, I don't think the nexus between rhythm and law we find in that dialogue is simply incidental. I think it's pointing us towards an important connection that can be drawn between the two, which will be one of the key things I'll try to talk about today, towards what I will describe as a musicalised vision of citizenship in the laws, musicalised vision of citizenship. So the final contextual note I'd like to make is that what I'm presenting today is part of it's taken from a chapter in an upcoming monograph I'm working on, which is trying to use this concept of rhythm in relation to legal theory and to an extent socio-legal studies, as well as, I'll leave it at that. And today's presentation is basically extracted from chapter 2, which is the only chapter concerned with Plato or ancient philosophy. So the book is mostly there, but it's not all the way there yet. And the way I'm presenting and framing this today is admittedly a bit of an experiment in that regard. So in that sense, I'm very much open to all sorts of questions, criticisms, confusions about this. This is still a work in progress, so anything on that would be helpful. So with those sort of broader contextual notes, what I'll do now is just say what exactly you can expect today. So what am I actually doing? What's the plan for today? So the plan for today is that first, given that this book is aimed at legal theorists and socio-legal scholars primarily, that's sort of where it's sitting in the terms of its series, etc. I wanted to initially enter my discussion of Plato's laws by taking a look at how the text has been mobilized alternatively within this 2012 article by a leading natural law thinker, that's a term I'll explain later, John Finnis. Now, I don't care too deeply about trying to critique Finnis today. That's not my main point. I mainly use this to sort of help open up the discussion because I think he reads the laws in a really interestingly misleading way. And what's interestingly misleading about it, I think, can help open up to the sort of things I'd like to talk about in terms of a rhythm analysis of Plato's laws. And I think this angle on Plato's laws is particularly interesting insofar as it opens up three dimensions, and dimensions which take us very far from how this dialogue is used in contemporary legal theory, sometimes anachronistically. So first, the first dimension is that I think this angle upon Plato's laws demonstrates or argues that the problem of law giving in the dialogue, or maybe of law giving more generally, is related to the question of temporal and spatial ordering. And in the law specifically, law giving is that which constitutes social time as distinct from, but in relation to cosmic time. This will start to make more sense as we go on, but that's the first point. The second point is that this distribution of order is one that is concerned with, in the dialogue, synchronization across multiple scales, from the cosmic to the institutional to the citizen in everyday life. So as has been noted by many in the late Plato, we see that the terms statecraft and soulcraft are sort of united in Plato, that the government of the state is the government of souls of the citizens. And for me in the laws, this is about the distribution of time and space, as well as how the citizen's everyday life can synchronize and map onto the rhythms of institutions as well as cosmic rhythms. So we have this sort of threefold synchronization. And to say a little bit more about what that means for the citizen in everyday life, and as I already hinted, I think that we can describe, or we can imagine, citizenship itself as musical in the laws. And as I'll go on to explain, I really do not mean this in any metaphorical sense at all. If there is a subject of law in the laws, it is a musical subject, a participatory subject, a performative subject, whose citizenship is really indissociable from rites, rituals, repetitions, and rhythms. The good citizen is the good performer who plays their role, who remains on key, strikes the right notes. These sound like metaphors, but they, as we'll see, are quite literal. Which is to say that governance itself is also about choreography. Indeed, the collective participatory performance of everyday life itself must be thought of, I think, or I argue, as a collective devotional ode to the cosmos, which continually loops around and repeats itself year by year in the imagined city-state of the laws. That's sort of the aim that Plato's going for. So after I've done all that, by way of concluding, I will just offer some reflections on Plato's imagined project in this dialogue. He seeks to offer a roadmap for the constitution of social order, and whilst I don't defend the details of his project, it's too theocratic, basically, in many senses. He does nonetheless do what seems to me that a lot of critical projects have to do but don't do enough, which is to say, imagine new visions of social endurance, new ways of life, new ways of establishing modes of social synchrony across temporal, institutional, ecological, and cosmological scales. It seems to me that any critical project needs to be not simply concerned with moments of rupture, transformation, and resistance, and so forth, but additionally, and at the same time, with thinking about new forms of social endurance and rhythm, with thinking about what I would tend to call new rhythms of everyday life. So that's quite a long context, I know, but hopefully that was set us up for what's to come, and hopefully a clear way. Okay. That's the point I just made. Okay. So obviously that's not Finis, that's Aquinas in the picture. So with hopefully the ground cleared and with a better sense of where this research sits in both my own work and in connection with the work of this particular series, let me now turn to John Finis, his natural law theory, and how he uses Plato's laws. So, as I have mentioned, Finis is one of the most well-known, influential, and cited thinkers working in the field of philosophy of law or jurisprudence. And in Anglo-American jurisprudence, they still take very seriously this debate or division between natural law thinkers on the one side and legal positivists on the other. So I'm not going to assume you know this distinction, but so I'll spend just a couple of moments just briefly defining what these are. So broadly speaking, the debate between natural law thinkers and positivists concerns the articulation of when law is actually law, which is to say, when can we accord some social or enforce social rule the status of legitimate law, as opposed to something like brute power? When is something stop becoming power, and when is it law as something that's extra to power, that's legitimate power in some way? This is what this debate is concerned about. So when law is actually law, it confers upon it, so it is said, a certain legitimacy through which the imposing of legal obligations in everyday life can be rationally, politically, or morally justified in some way. So legal positivists, as the name suggests, generally are concerned with the ways in which laws are posited, and this is from the Latin positum. You know, the process of lawmaking has the legislator pass the law. And secondly, they're concerned with whether people are actually obeying the law. So we have the process through which laws are posited, and whether or not people obey the law. So for positivists, this is what makes law, that there's an official way in which the law has been passed and that people are obeying it, generally speaking. So these are both questions of what tend to be called social fact, right? These are not questions that can be deduced from rational calculation. They're empirical questions, right? How are laws passed in this society? Do people obey it? That's a behavioral, empirical question. So for positivism, in its sort of barest sense, in thinkers in the 19th century work of people like John Austin, most famously, law is law whenever there are commands attributable to a sovereign which are habitually obeyed. And legal obligations pertain in the context of a society where they have this process and people generally obey. So natural lawyers, the side John Finis firmly sits on, dispute the centrality of social facts to the question of what makes law, and instead place what gets called moral facts central. So for the natural law thinker, moral facts are natural facts, not social facts, which is to say that law finds its basis in nature and in the morality we can find through our natural capacities of reason. So different natural lawyers will tend to emphasize different combinations, but broadly speaking, they will simply note that what is required for law, to be legitimate law, is some alignment or correspondence between social and moral facts in the legal system. So for natural lawyers, the question of legal obligation must be put into some sort of relationship with moral obligation, whereas for the positivist, legal and moral obligations have no necessary connection and may be contingently related if particular social facts obtain. So interestingly, but perhaps unsurprisingly, this sort of question is the starting point of Plato's laws. The opening pages of the dialogue are concerned with the source of law. Now, the main character in the dialogue, who is not Socrates, but rather the perennially unnamed Athenian, asks his two fellow travelers, Cleinias, the Cretan, and Megillus, the Spartan, who it is that ought to be given credit for legal arrangements in their respective cities. The Cretan and the Spartan both agree that such responsibility should be accorded to the relevant gods, which is to say different gods, Zeus for Crete and Apollo for Sparta. Although, for reasons I'll discuss later, I think it tends to be a little anachronistic to talk about what Plato's doing in terms of natural law theory, but I wanted to just highlight that this is sort of the way in to a natural law theory approach to Plato, which tends to be how he is discussed. So I just wanted to make 2 points, or is it 3 points? No, it's 2 points on how Finis uses Plato's laws. So first, Finis offers a conception of the judicial and moral subject in Plato, in which practical reasoning takes the form of and this is maybe familiar to people who've read much analytic philosophy, to the evaluation of propositional content. So, to put it another way, the subject engaged in practical reasoning needs to adjudicate between different opportunities for their life. So whether they be in the satisfaction of their emotional appetites, the satisfaction of their libidinal appetites, or alternatively, what Finis calls various worthwhile opportunities. And that can include knowledge, friendship, marriage, and the pursuit of truth. Now, Finis supposes that these worthwhile opportunities are always and necessarily preferable when the judicial or moral subject puts these to the test of practical reasoning. So such reasoning is ahistorical. We, just like Plato, according to Finis, are compelled by reason to prioritize friendship, marriage, and truth to our emotional and libidinal fluxes. So in sum, Finis thinks Plato is offering an image of the process of practical reasoning, which is concerned with accessing this sort of ahistorical space of reason, upon which sound judgment can be based upon. So Finis's image of Plato's moral subject, which given his natural law theory is the basis of any further idea of the legal subject, is first and foremost, and most importantly, a reasoner. Reason itself being further timeless and historical. So that's the first point I'd like to draw from Finis. Second, and here drawing specifically on the laws, Finis does something I think is a little bit strange. Now he tries to argue, and if anyone who know much about sort of ancient Greek culture and philosophy, maybe you'll understand why this is strange. He tries to argue that Plato accords to heterosexual marriage, the institution of heterosexual marriage, this status of a basic worthwhile good, which can be ahistorically agreed upon by reasoning subjects. So I'd like to quote Finis on this, and it is relevant. I promise you it's relevant to what I want to go on and actually discuss. But I nonetheless wanted to put the quote here because I think it's quite odd, but I also don't really want to read it out loud. So I'm going to put the quote here, and I'm going to wait maybe 20 or 30 seconds to allow you to read it for yourself, if that's okay. Yes. Is that about enough time? A bit more time, I'll give you a bit more time. Thumbs up. Okay. So when I first read this, I needed to do a double and then a triple take on this claim because of how out of kilt it is with really much of what I know about ancient Greek culture and philosophy and so on. And especially if you spent any time with even, I don't know, History of Sexuality, volumes 2, 3, etc. So what Finis says about what the unnamed Athenian says in the laws in this section of the dialogue isn't totally incorrect, but it's only part of the story. And the part of the story that Finis misses, I argue, and this is what's interestingly misleading, according to me, right? That's what I said earlier. So what he misses not only complexifies what the unnamed Athenian recommends here, but additionally problematizes Finis's idea of the process of moral reasoning engaged in by the legal subject. So if we go into detail on this point a little bit more, it really puts into question Roman numeral 1 there, Roman numeral I, this idea of the subject that Finis has in Plato's laws. And I think then it makes more sense to start talking about a musicalised vision of citizenship when we actually go into the detail of the dialogue. So there's a further point worth mentioning before I do this on Plato's apparent according of heterosexual marriage, the status of a basic innate good, timelessly accessible by rational participants in the ideal of truth. This is how Finis sort of presents it. And this point concerns the relationship between the laws and Plato's much more well-known dialogue on legal and political theory, namely the Republic. Now, as you can imagine in such scholarship, how to reconcile these two texts is a matter of continued disagreement. Plato undoubtedly offers a different project in the laws than in the Republic. Or in any case, the details of the dialogue become occupied in different sorts of questions. So the Republic is searching, as you all know, for the ideal of justice with a capital J. It really does seem to be trying to participate in this timeless realm of truth with a capital T, goodness with a capital G, and beauty with a capital B, and so on. But the laws isn't concerned with this at all. And the laws is at times almost an inverse image of the Republic in terms of its objects of attention. So the laws is less philosophical, more theological, but also concerned with minutiae of administrative, distributive, constitutional, and organizational detail, whereas the Republic is an ode to philosophy and the elevation of philosophy to a principle of political and legal rule, and is conducted in a space where the ultimate object of attention is not concrete actualization, but abstract justice. That's the Republic. So this is not to say the two projects are incompatible, just that they appear to be distinct. So I'm not too concerned with wading into too many details here, but it is important to note that the unnamed Athenian from the laws, time and time again in the dialogue, refers to the imagined city-state that they talk about in the dialogue, which goes by the name of Magnesia, as the second best city. And the standard interpretation of this is that therefore Magnesia is second best to the Kallipolis, the beautiful city of the Republic. It is as if, and this is just one interpretation, the laws is a pragmatic and flexible application of the Republic. So whereas the Republic imagines general ideals, some particulars, but nothing compared to the laws is really specific and particular, attuned to particular characteristics such as locality, ecology, environment, local political and religious practices, and so forth. The laws really is a practical juridico-political program which prioritizes effectiveness, whereas the Republic is a philosophical program which prioritizes truth and justice. So if this is true, I brought up that bullet point a bit too soon. So if this is true, recall that in the Republic, Plato imagines for the guardian class the abolition of the family in what has been described as a communism of wives, husbands, and children. In such a context, we must find it a little odd for Plato to not ascribe to the most important class in his beautiful city a heterosexualized vision of marriage, if he did indeed take it to be the basic innate good that Finis thinks Plato thinks it is, if that makes sense, right? So the vision of marriage in the laws, in effect, just like most things in the laws, represents Plato's negotiation with the ideals of the Republic, broadly speaking, such that the institutions would be more likely to work in practice in the specific situation and context he imagined. The laws is not about announcing these sort of ideal, timeless truths in the way that Finis presents. And it's much more nuanced and much less clear-cut than Finis suggests. So what key information is he missing? So this is just a reference to a particularly good chapter which discusses the marriage laws in Plato's laws. So in this particular chapter, Gonzalez initially notes how it's quite odd that Plato even suggests outlawing homosexuality and questions homosexual love, given that this is contradicted by more voluminous and more praising discussions of all types of love in Symposium and the Phaedrus, etc. Gonzalez also highlights a further element, which highlights how much the unnamed Athenian really struggles with this law, to the point that he argues that this particular law threatens to undermine the entire project of law-giving that Plato imagines in the dialogue. So the unnamed Athenian, in this context where he describes this law, the unnamed Athenian discussing extramarital relations between men and women, so someone having an affair with someone, is deeply concerned, Plato is deeply concerned with the supposed threat of sexual disorder posed by what are described as virulent young men. And he introduces something really unique in the laws, a get-out clause. Plato effectively admits here that a law prohibiting extramarital affairs will be practically unenforceable. Instead, he opts for a second best law. And I'll quote Gonzalez here. Do I have the... Yeah. So I'll quote Gonzalez here. I don't have the quote in the slides, but it's a very short quote. So this is a quote. If it has proved impossible to outlaw the practice of the sexual acts in question, then all that remains is to outlaw their appearance. The second best law will therefore demand only that previously prohibited sexual acts be kept concealed. So I think we must follow Gonzalez in finding this to be a very strange kind of law, where you admit you can't outlaw the practice you want to outlaw, and instead outlaw people publicly showing that they're disobeying the law. So it legalizes a kind of deception about whatever law is put in place. And indeed, in another odd sense, it's a legal obligation to be dishonest about one's illegal conduct. So you're legally obligated to lie about your disobeying of a particular law. It is what Gonzalez described, to give it a sort of another phrase, as a license to obey the law against extramarital affairs in appearance while violating it in deed. And as a further point, the continued exclusion of homosexual relations in the laws is odder still. It is as if the law is saying, if you're going to deceive the law, you can only deceive the law in this way. So it remains unclear why the virulent young man wouldn't just pursue wherever Eros directed. Right? It seems very odd to say you can only lie in this particular way about your illegal conduct. So let me try and bring this back. So to put it in a sentence, when Finis argues that Plato in this part of the laws describes the heterosexual marriage as an institution exhibiting the sort of basic good that all reasonable persons can agree on ahistorically, he totally misses that it is at this precise point where the entire project of the laws is potentially fatally undermined. The unnamed Athenians' get-out clause could also be construed as a tacit admission that this prohibition is extremely weak, impossible to defend, with anything other than a concoction of non-enforcement, deception, and force between citizens and legal authorities. What the unnamed Athenian prioritizes is the appearance that this law is followed, prioritizing public performance rather than private deed. Indeed, in this specific and only instance, this is the only time where it happens. Okay. So Gonzalez's critique of the unnamed Athenians project here highlights how this tension in Book 8 of the laws may be ruinous to the foundation of this new city-state. Nonetheless, and this is where we'll start to pivot a little bit, I wanted to pick up on a theme that this discussion can direct our attention towards. And one of the reasons why this part of the dialogue threatens to undermine the entire project is that it's so unlike the rest of the dialogue in separating these two terms you see in the title of the slide, in its separating of statecraft with soulcraft, in its seeming admission that there is some private realm outside of the public sphere of citizenship which the laws cannot mold. Everywhere else in the laws, statecraft and soulcraft and the sort of public performance of citizenship is what the project's all about. And this is the one place where it's not, which is one of the reasons why it's so odd. So citizenship in the laws, apart from the get out clause aspect, is the object of permanent practice and public performance. Everyday life is itself in the laws ordered in a manner akin to a musical score. And it mustn't be forgot here that the title of the dialogue, nomoi, the plural of nomos, which we translate as law or custom, was also used in one of its forms in the ancient Greek to denote a musical strain, ode, or composition. We can think about the musical nomos, the ways in which sort of a performance or musical piece was regulated and the score of that piece, broadly speaking. So what I would like to therefore suggest is that outside of Book 8, where the matrimonial law stuff happens, Plato's imagined colony is a musical polity, necessarily rhythmic and harmonic polity, in which the citizens are continuously performing the nomos, in which the laws themselves are functioning as a script or score to be performed as an aesthetic, legal, political, and religious ode to cosmic rhythms. So, in order to go into a little bit more detail on this, I'd like to say a little bit about how Plato uses the term rhythm in the laws. Now, the problem of rhythm in Plato, and indeed for others, is always the problem of order, of bringing or inculcating order into movements. Ordering movements of all kinds is, if you like, coincident with the task of law-giving. Now, the power of rhythm can be harnessed for the ambitious performative project Magnesia's citizens are expected to actualize. For example, in Book 6, Plato discusses childcare in infancy and early childhood. And what he says here is, I think, crucial and quite interesting. So I'll quote him at a little length here, except this time I will actually read out the quote. So what the story says, quote, what the story says is that pretty well any young creature is incapable of being quiet, either physically or vocally. It has to be trying to move and make sounds all the time. Now jumping and skipping, dancing for pleasure, for example, or playing games, now uttering all kinds of sounds. Other creatures, we are told, have no perception of order or disorder, what we call harmony and rhythm in these motions. But in our case, the gods, we said, were given to us to be our companions in the dance. They are the ones who have given us the ability to take pleasure in the perception of rhythm and harmony. This is their way of moving us and acting as our chorus leader, joining us with one another through song and dance. So the child, we have to imagine the child fearfully moving around, needing to be calmed. The child's sort of fearful, discordant, and disordered motions, and this is praised by Plato, these are calmed by the art of rocking the child. And so this sort of basic act of rocking the child, this sort of basic rhythm, is that through which the child learns how to overcome fear and cultivate the seeds of courage through this rhythmic and emotional regulation. What is more, rocking, in being but one conduit to the experience of ordered movement, immediately connects us to the gods, who have given us this ability to cognize, feel, and take pleasure from order. And so it can be properly thought of as a passage through which we can, if only partially, connect with the gods. This is how Plato's articulating this, I think. Rhythm is thus immediately concretely embodied in the basic art of rocking a crying child and the calm this act hopefully engenders, but is also a basic imitation of the very order that governs the cosmos. And what follows in the rest of the dialogue, and this is one of the things I try and argue, is an entire pedagogy of rhythm that occupies citizens all the time. So this pedagogy of rhythm is there in the moulding and bodies and souls from this basic stage of infancy. When we rock the child, that's the most basic rhythm. But this is really only the starting point. So I'll now briefly highlight some more examples where this rhythmic pedagogy of citizenship is put into play in the bodies of the citizenry in what is a really tightly regulated normative vision of what the sort of bodies are going to be that occupy this city-state. So the first is in compulsory physical training, separated into dancing and wrestling. Wrestling is concerned with the development of functional capacities such as fitness, agility, strength, and balance. Training in what is termed, and this is a quote, the contraction and extension of the limbs and body parts themselves, and the transmission of rhythmical movement from one part to another, end quote. Regarding dance, which is concerned not with functional capacities, which is the domain of wrestling, but rather with representation and aesthetic form, the dancer must model and dance in a manner fitting, quote, the well-governed citizen. So even in dancing, what we're doing is imitating the movements of the good citizen. One of the reasons, the reverse also holds, right? Being a good citizen is also doing the dance properly. So while the performance of citizenship is, in one sense, a full-time job, Magnesia also has an entire calendar and program of festivals, performances, and games, which concentrate and intensify this kinetic and sonic governance into more structured and ritualized forms. So as Lucia Purcell describes, the colony is a community perpetually reenacting through song and dance one of its foundational myths, namely the divine bestowal of song and dance themselves, which is what Plato was talking about in the quote I referenced in the previous slide. So communal choral songs and dances, as well as festive performances, through this reenactment, allow for the ritual transformation of the space and time of the polis, such that they can, if even briefly, convene with the gods. So choral performances are the embodiment of collective devotion and prayer. The Athenian describes these continuous enchantments as, quote, and this is the bullet point here, the city singing to itself. And social rites and rituals are embodied, participated, and performed by citizens as both an imitation of, ode to, and partial communion with cosmic order. So as Secham puts it, dance is imagined as corporal prayer. Dance is a type of corporal prayer. And the Magnesian polis never stops singing and dancing or praying. Citizenship is a continuous aesthetic, kinetic, and devotional dance. So, festivals, and just to continue this theme, festivals and choral performances allow us to connect with, to, and honor the gods who made possible this synchronization between pleasure and the good through rhythm and harmony. So the solidarity and joy brought through such rituals can also thereby further strengthen the bonds tying the citizens together. So every festival strengthens the bonds of the polis even further. But it also strengthens the bond between the citizens and the laws themselves. And this is because Plato also suggested that the laws themselves must be set to music, poeticized, performed, and even danced. So this is one of the reasons why I do not think it's at all metaphoric to think about a musicalized vision of citizenship, because the citizens are literally singing and dancing the laws every day. So Jared Nadav has an interesting piece where he even strongly suggests that the entire code of laws, the entire code and its law, should be set to music, adapted to rhythm and harmony, and sung in chorus with the accompaniment of the lyre, either collectively or individually. So this corporal prayer is at one and the same time a performance of devotion to the gods, as we've already said, but also to the laws. So I could, of course, go into a lot more detail, and there's so many things I'm really glossing over in this rapid sort of presentation of it. But before I kind of move towards making some concluding comments, I wanted to just linger a little moment longer on Plato and think about such festivals and performances across those three scales I mentioned earlier, right? The cosmic scale, the institutional scale, and the scale of the citizen. So, So these festivals are scheduled and planned according to the solar year. It almost sounds too obvious to say, but that's important to note, right? These are scheduled and planned according to the solar year. And the unnamed Athenian notes how the motion and principles of motions in the heavens are the empirical basis upon which, for the majority of people, principles of regularity, order, and repetition can be observed and thus imitated. So, I mean, to think that we're imitating the cosmos is quite literal here in Plato. Planets follow the same circular path on Plato's cosmology, and as planets are ensouled gods, again, in the context of Plato's cosmology, they can quite literally provide guidance in the realm of practical reason and action through the order they exhibit, through the regularity they exhibit, and through their emotional circles. So, in his roughly contemporaneous cosmological dialogue, the Timaeus, Plato famously put in the mouth of the titular character that time itself was constituted by planetary motions. So the movement of the planets is that which is time. Time is nothing other than the movement of the planets. And cosmic time, it has been fashioned in such a way that the time that the cosmos constitutes is a moving imitation of number. A moving imitation of number. And so, what happens in the laws is we have the foundation of a legal settlement which tries to imitate the order of the cosmos. And as such, the social calendar is highly structured and regularized in imitation of this cosmic regularity. So this annual repetition can be thought of as the process through which social time, as distinct from cosmic time, is constituted. Because social time is a moving imitation of cosmic time. So this can be when certain citizens gather in specific places during the year and at specific times during the year, producing certain kinetic and sonic motions. So in festivals, or to even give another more mundane example, in Book 6, the unnamed Athenian discusses the appointment of rural commissioners at great length. Who have extensive responsibilities in city upkeep, but also in the resolution of minor disputes. So these rural commissioners serve 2-year terms and have a team of officers. And during this term, these officers will, on a monthly basis, move eastward or rightward to the next immediate section of the city, which is, of course, tends to be organized, I believe, like a circle, though maybe we can get clarification on that. But nonetheless, these rural commissioners move in a circle as the year proceeds. So this tightly regulated imitation of cosmic regularity is a principle that doesn't just found exceptional events like festivals, but also in the mundane monthly movements of the citizenry and public officials. So our imitation of cosmic order must reach into all aspects of the city. So that was that. I should have kept up with that a bit better, but okay. So with all that being said, I'd like to just make a couple of brief concluding comments that kind of speak to the imagined audience of the book in legal theory and socio-legal studies, but also to the extent that it doesn't overlap with also to you today and to the thematics of the workshop series. Firstly, picking up from where we just left off, namely my claim that in the laws, Plato offers a vision of a city constantly dancing and praying, governed by rhythm and harmony in an attempt to imitate cosmic motions, enforced through a vision of everyday life of training, discipline, and practice. So the musical vision of citizenship is aesthetic, but that does not mean it is not an effect of power. Plato imagines citizens who are described as subject to the discipline of number, their rhythms of everyday life totally integrated into the regulation of sonic and kinetic flows, what they say and how they move, their gestures and speech. Rhythm as a conceptual entry point invites us to investigate both the critical stance of considering how order is instituted in everyday life through our quotidian cycles and routines, and also our participation in social reproduction thereby, or not. So we can think about how power mobilizes and deploys rhythm. But insofar as rhythm does have this capability to be deployed, it also invites us to ask creative questions about new kinds of life rhythms we might want to create. Now, the difficult task of trying to imagine how things could be otherwise is one that in some instances I think rhythm could be of partial service to, pointing us in the direction of not just the importance of centralizing everyday life, but also with how everyday life needs itself to be integrated and synchronized with social, political, technological, infrastructural, ecological, and cosmological rhythms. So I think this sort of multi-scaled thinking is really incredibly difficult. And while there's much to be unimpressed with in the details of Plato's laws, the attempt to think about the relationship between these scales is not one of them. It's a strength. So that was that. So I did launch into this discussion via some comments on John Finnis's work, and whilst it's not really my priority, for the sake of completeness, I just wanted to quickly loop back to sort of note why I started that way, or why I thought what I think I've done that's maybe different from how Finnis does it. So Finnis, in his perhaps overly narrow focus on the law being put in primary relation to reason, logos, and nature, misses out on the quotidian, qualitative, kinetic intensity of citizenship in the laws, and all those musical and devotional aspects of it, which are not at all incidental. Law is the performance and distribution of social order, about the regulation of flows, the stabilization of disbalances, and the process of social reproduction. And it can be about the transformation of all these things. And I think approaches which miss this dynamic aspect of the law on our quotidian everyday encounter with it, and focus instead on grounding law's authority, are missing an important part of the picture of the role, purpose, and function of legal institutions. In addition, Finnis is out of sync with Plato in the vision of the legal subject. The citizen is not a juridical moral subject concerned with the propositional content of laws, but primarily and foundationally a musical subject whose affective, kinetic, and sonic motions are the ground upon which citizenship is based. Reason enters much later in the maturation of the citizen, and alone does not and could not do the job. Further, citizens of the laws are not philosophers. Even the governors of Magnesia aren't philosophers. But all citizens and governors can know, see, and imitate cosmic movements. The guide for practical action is not principally or primarily, P.S. Finnis, the invisible space of reason, but the visible and ordered motion of the planets. Thirdly and finally, and you'll be happy to know this is where I'm about to shut up, I don't presume to know what any of you may be thinking or potentially interested in discussing, but personally I'd be hugely interested to hearing, as I said earlier, any thoughts and potential criticisms, connections, or maybe gaps that you can see that I can't. So I know we have a lot of people interested in different things, and I'd also love to hear if any aspect of what I've said here maybe connects with your own work in ways that might be surprising and interesting if we can't think of any questions. Okay, that is quite enough from me. Thank you all very much. I'll stop sharing the screen. Thank you.